Welcome to another observability clinic. Today's topic is Dynatrace Synthetic On Demand, a new capability which was recently introduced. And I'm not the expert in it, but the expert is actually Tobi. That's why I introduced and invited Tobi. Hi, Tobi. How are you doing?
So, hi, Andy. I'm doing fine, doing perfectly fine.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for doing this. And I just want to give people a little heads up. If you're watching this either on YouTube or on Dynatrace University, the best way to get a hold of us is if you are using community.dynatrace.com, if you have questions on it, or you have our names if you want to get directly in touch with us. I'm pretty sure you'll find a way. But if you have questions to this feature in particular, you want to know things, you can also use the in-product chat in Dynatrace, right? But this is part of my observability clinic season. Dynatrace Synthetic is a big part, I think, and opens up great new use cases around cloud automation, around continuous delivery, around DevOps and SRE. But now Tobi, I want to hand it over to you because you've prepared cool background information and awesome live demos. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. I can only second what you just mentioned. Definitely opens up a bunch of new use cases, which are I'm at least super excited about. Maybe let me start with a quick introduction of what I'm actually doing at Dynatrace. I am an architect in our ACE innovation team based out of Amsterdam. Well, I'm based out of Amsterdam, not the entire team is based out of Amsterdam. If you wonder what the ACE innovation is all about, we are pretty much the team that works with customers on mostly automation related use cases. So for example, how can monitoring as a service be established in your environment, right? How can auto or remediation workflows be automated, and so on and so on. But also, and that's part of what I want to show you today, how quality gates and release decisions can be automated, right? So without further ado, I would quickly cover we quickly go into what we're learning today, what we're covering today. A couple of things. Well, first of all, what even is synthetic monitoring on demand? How can synthetic monitoring be covered, right? Once we covered those basics, then of course we want to demo how a synthetic monitor can be triggered and how data can be executed. Not only synthetic execution data, but also how user session data, right, which is coupled to synthetic executions. How can that be analyzed, which is of course also super interesting for our use case. Then we're gonna look at a couple of use cases, right, specifically for release validation, right? So what we're working on. And then last but not least, a demo of how these use cases would look like in a real life demo, in a real life DevOps automation pipeline. Okay, so let's start with quickly going through what synthetic on demand actually is. I think we did a good job naming the feature because it is pretty much exactly what the name says. It allows you to trigger synthetic monitors on demand. Not only does it allow you to trigger new monitors that you add, but also existing monitors. So there's a new feature or a new option, right, that allows you to select any monitor. I want to run you not on a schedule as it was before, but I want to run you only on demand, right? You can always trigger a monitor on demand, even though it runs on a schedule, but it's just a nice to have feature, right? Which of course allows us to reduce noise and really only have executions when we need them, right? In general, we established feature parity between on-demand synthetic monitors and scheduled synthetic monitors. That means that, of course, both HTTP and browser ClickPath monitors are available, right? But also, and that's super interesting for our use cases, also public and private synthetic locations are enabled, right? So think about, and we see that a lot with clients that we're working with, early, like pre-production environments, right, usually don't expose all of their applications to the outside world, to the internet, right? And prior to, these days, there's like pretty much little options to get real user feedback for those applications, because of course they're not exposed to any real users. What we can do now with the synthetic click path monitor, right? We can have a real user accessing your application from a private synthetic location, go through a bunch of steps and gather user data for that, right? Which is pretty awesome. And we can use that user data in internal applications and base a validation, base a quality gate on them, right? So that's pretty cool, I think. In general, when it comes to processing modes, something I want to just mention here, we're going to look into the demo, and I'll show you what that is all about as well. There's different processing modes for synthetic executions, right? Which really allow you to granularly define whether problems should be created, right? You want to test a early dev artifact, right? As part of your automation. Usually you don't want to have your entire environment triggering alerts and problems based on just an artifact that you wanted to get out and test, right? Frequently test, maybe every second one fails, doesn't matter, right? You can iterate over it. So usually you don't want to generate problems, right? And we can actually configure whether a synthetic execution triggers problem. Same for availability and performance statistics, right? If you want to have them available, then of course there are enabled by default, but you can just like disable them. And then, of course, execution details are available in the UI, which is nice to have a visual representation of last execution metadata, but also in the API, which of course, again, we're talking about automation, or I'm mostly talking about automation. So it's equally important that they're available. All those, not only execution details, but also the way they can be triggered and so on are available by API. I hope that makes sense, Andy.
It does. And just maybe to recap, what I just learned from you is, first of all, synthetic tests, as we have seen them, are typically used on a scheduled basis to validate that your applications in productions work as expected. And we either have the HTTP option where we can execute HTTP tests, typically for API-based testing, but also the browser click paths where we can say, can the user log on and then execute the transactions. And now with the on-demand capability, we can say, instead of running the test every 15 minutes for, let's say, availability monitoring, we can trigger it on demand as part of release validation. So you just deploy the new build and you don't want to wait for the next synthetic scheduled cycle, but you want to execute it now. But I think another big use case is also, as you mentioned, as part of maybe pre-production validation. You get a new build in a pre-prod environment, and now you want to execute certain synthetic tests on demand to validate, is this deployment, is this canary or is this blue-green deployment or pre-prod environment deployment actually working well enough so at least the APIs work well and the major use cases. And for these, I really like the whole processing modes that you just explained. For those you don't want Dynatrace to generate additional alerts, because you typically trigger those tests from your automation pipeline anyway, and therefore you immediately get the feedback from the synthetic API into your automation, so you don't need Dynatrace to additionally alert on it. And it's really exciting and opens up so many new use cases. But I think now it's time for a demo, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. So let's jump right into the demo. Let me just share my screen. Here we go. Sharing the screen.
Perfect. Can you zoom in a little bit, maybe?
I can, of course, I can zoom in. It's better like this.
It's better like this.
A little bit more screen real estate.
Yeah.
So, okay. So what do I want to show you right now? Ignore the two synthetic monitors that are here right now, right? What I want to show you, well, first of all, how a new monitor can be created. And a new monitor can be created and also configured as a monitor that can be executed or triggered on demand. For the first demo, I just want to create a basic HTTP monitor, right? And I call it my first monitor, right? Doesn't really matter for our demo. And that's, I guess, the important part, right? Which artifact, which application do I want to test? And again, just for the demo purposes, I prepared a demo application, which is already up and running. I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. But for now, I just use that URL, and that URL is just, I mean, there's no magic here. It's a simple HTTP endpoint. It's exposing a website, and all I want to do as part of my HTTP test, right, call that request URL with a get method, and make sure that there is no status code larger than 400, which is usually either then a 200 okay or a redirect, which is also fine for me. That's the basic verification that I want to do. In addition, before I actually set it up, I want to add a tag. And a tag is not important for the first demo, right? But I want to show you something cool in the second demo with that. So I tag it. You already see that there are some tags that have been set up. And I'm just going to add that tag, simple node service dev. Simple node service is a simple Node.js service that we deployed in the background. Actually, the UI that you just saw, the website, is our simple node service. Just a demo application exposing some very basic APIs, allows us to run our demo. But I'll get back to that in a second. So now we configured the endpoint. We configured a basic validation, right? Status code based validation. And now here where we actually for the first time get into the on-demand situation or feature of Dynatrace, right? So earlier you could select frequencies here, right? What we can now do is, I mean, of course, I think I mentioned it earlier, right? You can still run a monitor every 5 minutes and then trigger it on demand, but there's no, for our demo, right, or for a pipeline, there's no benefit in having that. So I just want to only run that particular monitor on demand, right? No schedule, no nothing, just on demand. And then, of course, but that's no different to regular ones, I want to select a location. And I'm going to select a location which is somewhere in the UA, because I'm also in the EU, because I'm also in the EU. And that's it, all right? I'm going to create again, gives you a quick overview. It's on demand only, just doing one basic request, and I'm going to create it. All right, okay. So in a second, we should see our new monitor. Here we go. And immediately what you see, not really related to the schedule that I set up, but just as part of the new feature, we do see a new button here saying on-demand execution. Everything else looks exactly like a scheduled or like a previous synthetic monitor, right? What we added is that on-demand execution section or button that actually presents you a section. And that section is also pretty clean, pretty straightforward, right? Gives you two options. First of all, you can trigger a new execution, which I'm going to do right now, even before I, okay, takes a second. There's a trigger a new execution section, right? And then there is a list of historic executions. Here at the bottom, of course, there's no historic execution because I haven't run any with that test. You just witnessed me setting up that particular monitor. But that's fine. You will see that. We will see that in a second. Now what happens in the background, actually the error I just got is because I chose a public location in Dublin, right? That tests my endpoint, or that runs my test. Currently the script or my single request that I set up is currently synced with that location. So we can later just pretty much schedule a new or trigger a new execution, which is sent to that public location and then runs through that script, or that I guess for me it's only one endpoint that I provided.
I'm kind of happy you ran into this issue, because maybe some others run into this as well, and now we know why. Because obviously your centrally configured tests need to be kind of pushed out to these locations, and that's good to know.
Exactly. As part of Well, I'll get. I don't want to spoil anything. As part of a pipeline, of course, we'll run into the same issue, but there's a workaround for that.
Mm-hmm.
So now, or not a workaround. I mean, it resolves itself naturally in a pipeline. But I'll get to that later.
Mm-hmm.
So now, immediately after I triggered it, right, you see that now there is, of course, the location is available, the test is available at that location. So it kicked off. You immediately see in the list of past executions that a new execution has been triggered with an execution state executed and result success, right? That's awesome. I cannot. Okay, it takes a minute. It's still loading. While we wait for that to complete, I want to quickly, again, not super important for our use case, just want to mention it, right? The options that we have here. I already mentioned there's different processing modes. Standard is pretty much reporting all problems, returns, performance, statistics, and so on and so on. But you can also, well, disable problem detection, which is still gives you execution details, but also performance metrics. Or you can disable everything apart from execution details, right? And then trigger it like this, right? Pretty much just configures how much information you get back. Of course, if you want to look at everything, then it makes sense to trigger the standard mode. If you're only interested in specific execution details, then that's also fine. You can just use that. Also, what you can set up, right? Not relevant for our monitor at this moment, right? But you can also make it fail on specific performance threshold violations, right? You can set up, okay, that request is only allowed to take a couple hundred of milliseconds, right? It's really not really a functional test. Is that available? But more, okay, does it take longer? Does it not satisfy any performance requirements that I have, and make it fail this way? Again, not really very relevant. As part of our pipeline, we're going to look at a little bit of bigger picture of all the objectives that we have set up, right? So for us, not super relevant. Now we see that the execution state also conveniently, right, at the same time changed to data retrieved, right? And that data retrieved is an indicator that all data was retrieved. So I can go to execution details, right? Maybe what's important here, the execution ID. Every execution gets its own execution ID. If we would select multiple locations, right, then a monitor would be executed at each of these locations. That also means that we get multiple execution IDs, right? Just important to remember that, because we will reuse that very execution ID later on when we query a couple of things, right? I don't want to give it away just yet. Then here, let's look at the on-demand execution. You can either look at the last successful one, the last failed execution, mine didn't fail, so there is none, or all on-demand executions, I think over a time window of the last 6-ish hours, something like that. And here there's only one execution, so only one that I can look at, but it gives you back pretty much everything that you would be interested in knowing, just from an execution perspective, right? From a synthetic execution perspective. The request name, what was requested, of course, I only added one HTTP request, so that's it. The URL, the method, which request headers were sent along, which response headers were retrieved, and so on and so on. The entire response body, which I'm also not interested in at the moment, but also, of course, the response status code, then some performance related attributes, total time in milliseconds, TCP connect time, handshake times, and so on and so on. So all these things, right, are now available to you to be whatever you want to do with them, right? Just by on demand, right? I mean, that's the important part. They're available on demand to you whenever you need them.
And I assume this data then, and I will show this later, is also accessible via the API, because this then really makes this fly in an automation environment. Yeah, that's cool.
Exactly. So all this data, I mean, it already looks a little bit like an API response, right? But it is pretty much, of course, an API response. So the API, it's the environments v2 API, actually allows you to trigger executions. And I want to bring that up because that's what we use in the background, right? It's a post request we send to that very endpoint, and that post request allows you to specify a couple of things, right? Whatever we just specified in the UI, right? The processing mode, then that's toggle whether or not to fail performance issues, but also lets you specify specific monitors to trigger. So our HTTP check monitor, which locations to trigger. If you leave that blank, then all locations are triggered, but also, and that's even more important for our automation use case, right? Because as part of a pipeline, we very dynamically create synthetic monitors, right? We create them, we destroy them again, depending on the environment that we're working on, depending on the maybe even the pull request, right? Just the feature that is added, right? We want to test a specific feature, so we set up a specific click path only testing that feature, for example, right? So we might not know that very ID. So what we can also do, right? We can trigger a group of monitor by tag. Remember when I just added that simple node service dev tag, right? We can actually specify simple node dev here, and Dynatrace triggers all monitors that are tagged with exactly that attribute in the background.
That's really cool, because this then allows you, if you do tagging right, you can tag your tests based on environment. So which environment are testing against, what type of app, what type of service, group ownership, and you can say, please execute all the synthetic tests on demand in the production environment on this particular application. And I think this is the true power of this, right? Exactly
right. Right. And then same here, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but of course, in the same way that you see the execution details in the UI, you can of course also call every batch that you trigger. So every execution is multiple. Well, every trigger is actually a batch that is triggered in the very simplest form. It's only one execution, so you will get one specific execution ID. But of course, if your batch matches, or if your tag matches multiple tests or multiple monitors, there are multiple locations attached to it, then you'll get back multiple execution IDs as well. And you can retrieve information execution data either by calling them by batch ID, right? So if you provide that very batch ID, you will get that batch ID with all, just basic execution or batch execution data, or you're interested into specific execution IDs, which of course you can reuse and get either a basic report or a full report of that very execution, similar to what we saw in the UI.
It's really cool.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. So now, since we pretty much covered the basics, let's look into the use cases that are enabled now, right? Since we now can trigger them on demand, we can trigger them by API as well as UI. Right. So what use cases does it open up for us? Well, first of all, and I in no particular order other than I guess what makes sense in my head for it to occur as part of an automation workflow, right? So at the very beginning, right, or what we can test, application readiness, right? So a new artifact is built, a new artifact is deployed, it's made available somewhere. How do we know that artifact is ready, right? I mean, we can just blindly trigger our first test. It might fail, not because of performance or actual artifact or feature related or code related issues, but just because of the application not being ready, right? So as part of a pre or very early check, we could use a synthetic monitor testing that very endpoint, right? A new endpoint that has been created for that artifact. Or to take it one step further, we can even add a validation rule looking at, for example, a metadata or a version endpoint is not uncommon, right, for applications. So you could set up a monitor that validates the response of that very endpoint. So let's say you deployed a build one of a specific commit hash, for example, right? If that commit hash is returned by the metadata or by the version endpoint, then of course you can also validate that the application that you were about to test, is actually the actual expected application returning that commit hash, for example. A little bit later, or once we have made sure that my application that I want to test is actually up and running, right? I want to do some basic functional testing. And functional testing is pretty straightforward. Synthetic click path, clicking a button, detecting, validating whether a button is even there, right? Whether a banner is there, whether a menu item is there, whether a menu item is clickable, and so on and so on. So really basic functional tests. Based on that, once you know, right, early on, okay, my application, there's no regression, everything is there, we can start longer running tests. You don't want to waste your time, like starting a 15, 20, 30 minutes load test when you don't even know whether your application is functionally okay, right? And then even later on in the delivery life cycle, what you can do, you can test real user impact, right? So what I mentioned earlier, right? Even in internal applications, you can trigger a synthetic click path, look at user session attributes. Or what we've also been seeing, you can actually test real user impact of a system under load, right? So in parallel to a load test, for example, you can trigger a synthetic click path. That synthetic click path, the load test might still be fine. The load test tests endpoints. Maybe everything's looking fine, but that synthetic monitor is actually looking at, hey, how long did that user action now take? System is under load. How long did it take after when I click my button until a modal pops up or something like that, right? So really parallelizing load test and synthetic tests to detect real user impact. And then, of course, what you can also do, not really related to synthetic necessarily, but you can, of course, also use the on-demand feature. Once your application is in production, trigger a synthetic test, just make sure that your application is satisfying all the objectives, and then, maybe or perhaps trigger a rollback if that's not the case. Mm-hmm. All right. I think that's pretty cool use cases, right?
I think so, and I really like that you listed these three because I mean I'm a big load tester by heart, and especially the last one. Thanks for the reminder that you can actually combine you're using Gatling, Neotis, Load Runner, whatever it is to actually run load on an HTTP level. You can then also validate the end user impact, and I think this is what I really like. But overall, what we're doing here is really making sure as you're delivering new features, as you're delivering new versions of your app, Dynatrace helps you to reuse the concept of synthetic tests that we typically use for production availability monitoring. We allow you to reuse the same tests to validate that your system features, your business critical features are still working with every new release. And we do this in a fully automated way. And I'm pretty sure we'll see another demo of this.
Exactly. Before we jump into the demo, quick environment overview. Mm-hmm. The example automation pretty much tells you everything I just told you in the slide before, so I'm not going to dive into deep. Just for your understanding, synthetic tests can be added at any point in your DevOps automation, right? And for our DevOps automation, what I want to show you right now, today we pick Cloud Automation, Dynatrace Cloud Automation. We set up a pipeline in there, a sequence in there, right, which interacts with, well, first and foremost, Dynatrace, or all the application, right? First of all, it's instrumented with one agent, so it reports all metrics to Dynatrace, and then Dynatrace, of course, has all the synthetic location or synthetic capabilities, scheduling a monitor execution on a specific location, right? So it's really that holy trinity. Well, it's actually four 4 entities that are involved in everything, including cloud automation, that allows us to run that use case.
The Holy Trinity. Wow, that's a new that's a new word in that context. I like it.
happy to reuse if you want to. So that's just brief overview, because I really want to show you the demo, because I think that's the important part, right? Or that's the interesting part. So let me share my screen again. Here we go.
Perfect. Also from a size perspective, that's perfect for my screen size as well.
Okay, awesome. So we're looking at cloud automation here, and before I talk too much or explain too many things, I just want to trigger a delivery right away, and then we'll go from there. And what I do, I just sent, there's also a CLI command for that. I don't want to get into details because that's not relevant for the synthetic part. For now, all I want to do, or all I want to mention, that we're currently deploying a new artifact. An artifact might have been created as part of your integration pipeline, right? It has been made available, has been pushed to registry. We tell our delivery automation, hey, there's a new artifact available, please deploy that for me. And that new artifact, important, build number 2, that very release version or build version. In particular, the DT release build version, we pass along a couple of metadata. So for example, some labels, some values, and so on and so on. I wouldn't worry about them for now. Again, not super relevant for our use case, just how our pipeline works. So I execute it. It should return a captain context, and then in cloud automation, internet is a little slower today, so I might need a refresh. The delivery has started. And what the delivery is doing, right? Well, first and foremost, we strongly believe in everything as code. So in the backend, in the background, first of all, there is a Git repository, versions every single configuration. The new artifact that we just pushed is persisted in that Git repository, but also monitoring configuration, right? So even before the application is deployed, we are configuring all entities and all configuration. We are configuring Dynatrace to make it aware of our application, right? So for example, the 2 synthetic monitors that you saw earlier here, that's the one that we just created. Those 2 monitors are, I didn't want to go into that. Those 2 monitors are created on demand, right? You could even take it that far that at the end of your delivery pipeline, if you, for example, destroy an entire environment because you don't need that very feature-focused environment, for example, you could even destroy all the configuration that you have in Dynatrace. For example, just a use case. For us, Monaco is running, of course, create synthetic tests, some other like request naming and calculated service metrics, all these things, right, that we need in the background to run evaluations, but not super relevant what's created. Relevant is that it is created as part of our pipeline. Then, of course, after monitoring is configured, the deployment happens. And that deployment, we're now deploying version 2. We will see if I go back to my deployment preview. Remember the URL that I copied earlier that we were reusing in our HTTP test. Earlier it was build number 1. If I refresh it now, we see that now build number 2 is deployed. In my staging environment, by the way, we're talking about 3 environments today. So I have my dev, my staging, and my production environment, right? My staging environment, you can tell by the URL that's requested. It says staging, production says production. My staging environment still has build 1 because we're not quite there yet, right? Our pipeline is still going through the deployment phase. What's currently happening after the deployment has been done, right? We're actually waiting a couple of we're just waiting some time. Usually, remember earlier when we ran into the issue where the synthetic location was not quite ready yet. Usually, if your deployment takes longer, it would resolve itself. Just for the sake of a demo, I introduced a small delay in here just to make sure that the synthetic location is available, the actual application is available, and so on and so on. Of course, in theory, what you could do, which is not part of the demo for the sake of time and what I want to explain, of course, you can introduce that application readiness check in here. Would be perfect situation right here, but not right now. So now what happens, right, in our dev environment after deployment has been done and the waiting period has been passed, a test is triggered, and that test is running a single. Well, no, actually, it's running more. It's running. Hold on, let me see what we have defined here, because what we said, we specified a specific monitor tag to test, right? And of course, as part of Monaco, my synthetic monitor here is tagged with that very tag, but also my first monitor that I set up earlier is also tagged with that tag, right? So both that first monitor and the monitor that was created by Monaco as part of the pipeline have now been triggered, right? So that's the two execution IDs you see. And those two execution IDs, right, can now be, well, first of all, what we do, those two execution IDs are reused in a later stage, but in this stage, what we're actually doing, just basic functional tests. Are endpoints available, or is my version button available, right? So if I show you that application, what it does, right? It, for example, clicks get my version, it waits for something here for an element to pop up, and so on and so on. So very, very basic functional tests. And those functional tests, they're really binary. Either they are successful or they're not successful. So what happens in the background, depending on that result, a score or a success failure rate is pushed to Dynatrace, right? And what we do as part of our dev stage, we just look at that failure rate or at that success rate. Okay, it's now starting the evaluation. It shouldn't take too long. Here we go. It's already there. Otherwise, I would have gone to one of the historic executions. But what we see here, an objective for the development stage, there's actually only one objective, and that objective is my synthetic test success rate must be 100%. Right, so I tell make up the objectives that my functional tests, 100% of my functional tests actually need to be successful. We're catching regression, we're catching some newly introduced bugs when your click path, for example, was updated. I want to catch that early on in my delivery pipeline. As a next step, once the test and the evaluation was successful in my development stage, right? Now staging is triggered. And in staging, it starts with exactly the same steps. First of all, Monaco's run, deploying the synthetic tests, management zones, request attributes that I need for my staging stage, for my new, the application in the new stage, and deploys that application. It's green, so I would already expect that remember my staging endpoint now also shows build number 2, right? So that's done. Then again, it waits, mostly for demo purposes. So I'll look into an historic evaluation. So for example, the one that we had here. So it waits, it tests, and now what the test is doing actually runs the test that or the scenario, the use case that I mentioned earlier. First of all, the job executor service here is running a basic Locust load test, right? So you're probably familiar with that output if you've worked with Locust before. It's running a very basic load test, but in parallel, my synthetic service is started, right? And that synthetic service then, of course, triggers executions. synthetic executions on demand, runs a couple of click paths just to verify, hey, how is my system performing under load? Are elements available, visible, and so on and so on and so on. And later triggers an evaluation. And here where the execution ID becomes relevant again, because all the synthetic monitors that are being triggered, remember when I mentioned every single monitor on every single location returns a specific execution ID, right? Because now what we can do, we can take that very execution ID and query user session data, right? That is pretty cool. We want to figure out, I have my system is under load. I want to have a synthetic user click certain things. I want to look into specific user action durations, for example, how my system is performing at that very moment when some other force, the load test in our example, is putting it under load, right? And I quickly want to show you that it's completely. Just go to my user session query, right? So what I can do, for example, select everything from user action, where user session, and here that's the important part. Here's the important part. That very execution ID, right? I'm just going to take. Can't remember which one was the HTTP monitor, but we'll see. We'll find out in a second. That very execution ID can now be queried by, right? So I'm going to run my query, and you see all the user session attributes that you would normally get from a user session, but now triggered as part of a pipeline in potentially an internal application. Right. So important for us, for example, what are we interested in? Average duration and then synthetic events. I want to group by synthetic events, run that query. All right, just show a table, which is a little bit nicer. And here we see for our new artifact for that synthetic test that we just triggered, the average page load duration was just under half a second. A specific synthetic event testing the version. Well, it's called version. What it does really, it's just triggering that button I just showed you to, pretty much interacting with the website, right? Took on average 1.1 seconds. And of course, with that data in here, we can set up objectives, right? Objectives say, my page load must take less than a second to pass. Everything less than 3 seconds is a warning, and so on and so on. I mean, all the SLOs that you can, that I'm sure you're aware of, and everybody has at least heard about. And and that's pretty much it, right? From a user session query perspective. Maybe let's look back into our cloud automation. Let's see what this is doing. So now the test has been run. It's now waiting for, well, it's now collected specific test metadata, and now it's running the evaluation. And what the evaluation is doing, I mean, we have triggered build number 2, just for the sake of time, because I, of course, tested my build number 2 before. That build number 2 will eventually fail because we are detecting a decrease in the invoke in a specific API where we set our objectives. What is it? Here we go. So there's actually a couple of issues here, but there's one failed. The response time invoke API method is definitely one that makes the entire build or contributes the most to the overall fail, I would say.
It's really impressive, Tobi. And especially here, you also show that the evaluations are not only limited to a single metric, but you're doing this across multiple metrics. We call them SLIs and SLOs that are relevant, and you can not only use the results from the synthetic tests. You can use any type of data that Dynatrace has in its observability platform, right? Anything from the end user, what you show, but all the way down to your pods, to your containers, to your nodes, whatever it is. And this is the power of it. And and you did a great job. I mean, it's so fantastic to see how synthetic tests on demand can be used and integrated into the delivery pipeline. Now, Tobi, if you do me one more favor, can you go back to the previous screen on cloud automation where you saw the sequences?
Sure.
Right. So just a reminder, this is Dynatrace Cloud Automation, where we give you orchestration capabilities, where Dynatrace Cloud Automation can orchestrate all of these tasks for you, like monitoring as code, deployment, testing. Now, all of this also works if you have already invested in your own delivery pipelines, if you have Jenkins, GitLab, Azure DevOps, whatever it is, Harness, and you want to integrate Dynatrace Synthetic On Demand, or even just the evaluation capability that Tobi showed, where we are looking at multiple metrics and then come up with a score. You can also integrate the individual pieces, because everything is API driven. But we want to give you with Dynatrace Cloud Automation the option to also orchestrate the end-to-end lifecycle of your apps. But in the end, it's up to you to what flavor you want to use it. Now, today is about Synthetic On Demand. If you are interested in more on cloud automation, there's many more videos out there that we've produced. But today, Tobi, it blew my mind how great this already is, especially your use case with you created an additional synthetic test, gave it a tag, and now the automation is picking up that same test, because maybe you have separated development teams and testing teams, and if the testing team is creating new tests and they're tagging them, they will then automatically be executed because everything is driven through the metadata through the tags. It's really cool.
Exactly.
Wow.
Cool.
Any additional information where people can look at? I think this is probably on the last slide.
Absolutely. I do have one more slide, which I hope. Hold on. Is this one?
You're back on your screen. Here we go.
Yeah. Demo. Here we go. So resources. If you're interested, well, first of all, as I already mentioned, we are the automation team, right? So we do have an entire team at Dynatrace that helps you implement automation use cases, and then, of course, Synthetic On Demand, integrating Synthetic On Demand into your automation pipelines, right? If you want to get going yourself, there's a bunch of information online. I want to start with the very general information, official Dynatrace information. You can either, I guess if you Google it, synthetic monitoring on demand, just the support documents provided by Dynatrace give you a lot of explanations of pretty much everything we covered today, right? What do all these processing modes mean, and so on and so on. So everything is on there. Important for automation use cases, of course, is the section about how everything can be integrated and can be triggered and I guess analyzed by API, right? So there's a section for that. And last but not least, I want to mention a blog that was published just a couple of days ago or weeks ago by one of our colleagues, pretty much also summarizing everything that we discussed, or well, probably in a little bit of a higher level, but giving a good, very, very good overview of how synthetic tests can be used for release validation. And that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tobi. The recording, as I said, most of you will watch the recording. It's on YouTube on Dynatrace University. If you want to get a hold of us, best way, if you have questions, community.dynatrace.com. There we have the discussion forums. Also feel free to use the in-product chat, or if you want to really get directly a hold of us, you have our names. I'm pretty sure you figure out a way how to reach us on different social media channels. Tobi, this was just the start, hopefully, from a series of observability clinics that I want to do with you, because you are out there all the time, as you said, with your team, with your services team, and implementing these things with customers. That means, folks, if you're listening, if you want to do this, but maybe you want to get a little bit of help, Tobi is also there and his team to implement these things with you. And so keep this in mind as well.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. And until next time.
Until next time.
Bye-bye.
Take care.